evening. I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on our news panel tonight, Tom Vacar, consumer editor, KTVU News. Rachel Gordon, City Hall reporter with the San Francisco Chronicle. And Wyatt Buchanan, Sacramento bureau reporter, also with the Chronicle. And Josh Richman, legal and political affairs reporter for the Oakland Tribune. Josh, tell us, how is California so far ahead of other states in implementing President Obama's health care bill?
Well, we had a governor, a former governor, albeit a former Republican governor, who was very supportive of it. And so even before this new administration came to power, California was kind of ahead of the curve on this. Former Governor Schwarzenegger signed legislation authorizing the creation of a health care exchange, which is basically a state-run marketplace where unemployed Californians will be able to get insurance. He appointed two relatively moderate people to it who are very likely to want to stay the course with the law as it was enacted. We actually got a little bit ahead of the curve even further yet by cracking down on insurance companies that didn't react well to the immediate mandate that they not deny insurance to children with pre-existing conditions. We basically said if you're not going to sell policies for kids, then you can't sell any individual health policies here for 5 years, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's been a lot of movement in California since the federal law was signed. All of this has been happening over the last couple of months. It really came into focus this week as this political theater played out in Washington as House Republicans voted on a bill to repeal the law that was enacted last year. I say political theater because I think even House Republicans know it's not going anywhere. The Senate won't take it up. The White House wouldn't sign it. And so, they're basically operating on a political level more so than a policy level. They don't actually have a plan right now to replace it. They voted to come up with a plan this past week, but they say they will come up with a plan eventually. It's really about the elections.
Let me ask you, because they did run on repealing the health care reform bill, so they followed through on their promise. On the other hand, we're seeing polling that shows that the American people really don't want the law repealed. So it seems that it's kind of crossing each other.
Yeah, well, it's going to be an interesting 2-year election cycle now. You know, if the GOP really decides that they want to continue with making this a centerpiece of their political agenda of rolling back these reforms that were enacted, it's going to be interesting to see how that meshes with this popularity of, at least the popularity of individual aspects.
Well, that's the interesting part of it. They say, well, we don't want to roll back the pre-existing conditions. We don't want to roll back this and this. And it's really the heart of what people want for the reforms anyway. Those are the issues they don't want to touch at this point.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like I said, they've yet to say exactly what they want to replace it with. If you want to know just how political this is, all you really had to see was the communications that the National Republican Congressional Committee was putting out early this week about Jerry McNerney, who's the most politically vulnerable congressman in the Bay Area. It was a lot of, will Jerry McNerney vote to uphold this job-killing, budget-busting law? And of course, he voted with almost all of the House Democrats to uphold the law, and they're pounding away at him. They only issued releases about McNerney in Northern California because he's the only one that they see as politically vulnerable. It's a campaign tactic.
With Obamacare, such as it's called, basically safe until early 2013 when that election is finalized.
Right.
Does this stop California from continuing to implement this, or does it retard the ability of the state to implement this, not knowing whether or not it's going to continue after that?
What happened this week doesn't really get in the way of California's implementation, but House Republicans, being in the majority, have some control over the purse strings now. And California's ability to really implement this over the next couple of years is going to depend on us having the money to do so. And we were counting on some federal money to do that. If that gets cut off, it's hard to see where it's going to come from. It's not like we have a lot of general fund money laying around, obviously, with a $28 billion deficit. So that's where things could really get hairy.
The federal government had said about $10 billion, I believe, is what California would get.
Something like that. Governor Schwarzenegger had estimated, former Governor Schwarzenegger, had estimated last spring that healthcare reform could cost about $2 billion or more a year once we get this up and running, and yet because of our budget problems, Governor Brown has now proposed cutting Medi-Cal by $1.7 billion and lowering the doctor reimbursement rate. So we're actually losing ground on the way that we finance healthcare in this state, while we're trying to, advance and implement and even get ahead of some of the national reforms that are supposed to save us money in the long run, according to the Congressional Budget Office, but going to cost some money in the short run to get it up and going.
So, of the monies needed, California doesn't have it. The Republicans could block the efforts to get the federal money.
Stymie our ability to get it, yeah.
So we may not be as far ahead as
well,
it's assumed.
we're getting as far as we can until somebody writes us a check.
And
isn't that always the way? Right?
Now, I noticed that the Republicans have taken some action to repeal abortion rights.
Yeah, and again, this is something that's been a matter of concern to the Republicans all along, and you're going to see that continue to ramp up. There are certain catchphrases you're going to hear a lot of. Job killing, although the evidence of that is a little shaky. Budget busting, the supposed fiscal irresponsibility of this plan, although the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, just said that repealing it is actually going to cost us a lot more. And hot button social issues like abortion. I mean, this is what turns people out to the polls when you get down to it. So.
Well, at the bottom of what you're saying as to whether we have a health care reform bill that's going to be going forward or not has to do with the budget, and that brings us to your story, Wyatt, about the redevelopment money that the governor would like to take possession of. Tell us, how is this money used by cities and counties, and why does the governor think he deserves to have it to help him fill that gap?
Sure. Well, the redevelopment money is used by cities and counties. They designate areas, that are urban blight that they want to redevelop, sort of give new life to. Oftentimes, they're areas where private developers aren't motivated enough to go just in on their own. So if there's some public money ponied up, well, they'll join in, and then we can have this great new project, a museum, something like that. And Governor Brown, what's happened is that it's funded through property taxes. The redevelopment money, once an area is designated as that, they'll get a portion of property taxes to further the redevelopment efforts. And when that money would have gone to schools, police, fire departments, things like that. And so Governor Brown is saying, well, these things, we've been cutting, we've got a budget problem. Let's stop this redevelopment. Let you decide if you want to do this locally. You can vote and have your projects locally, but no more taking the property tax money. We're going to give that back to the cities, the counties, school districts.
And the property tax money now is being held by whom?
Well, the redevelopment agencies, the local redevelopment agencies, they get a portion of the increase in value from the project, because you do this, the property value goes up.
So Wyatt, isn't that key, though, that it does supposedly spur economic development in communities when you have redevelopment areas? We've had that. We're going now in San Francisco looking at the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard area. That's supposed to bring jobs not only for building it, but for creating new businesses there, spurring home growth there. I mean, it seems maybe that's what you have to do, is to be kind of short-sighted now to balance a budget, but in the long term, that could really hurt communities that have relied on these redevelopment projects.
Well, a lot of academic, I guess, people who've looked at this question have said, it's really not clear that this actually helps spur development that wouldn't happen on its own. Some say instead of, it just moves where the development happens. Instead of it happening in this part of San Francisco, well, it's going to happen over here, but it would have happened anyway. So, that's a really open question on whether it actually, does sort of the goal that it's intended to, and that's you're seeing a real pushback by cities. The League of Cities had an event today in Sacramento. A few hundred mayors and councilmen standing up using rhetoric that we heard in the healthcare debate. This is a job-killing proposal. It's going to annihilate jobs in California, 300,000 jobs. So, but people who've really taken a look at this have said, it's not so clear that it actually
But we have, I mean, San Francisco would not look like the San Francisco we see today. The South Market area, the convention area, the museums that are here, would not look like that at all, would not have that kind of value. How can it be said that this would have just happened on its own? What happens with the redevelopment area, don't they designate it as an area where you get sort of special treatments and tax credits and all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's right, and that's where the argument is a little bit, because you've got the redevelopment agencies in the city saying, you know, how in the world can you say this isn't having an effect? Look at all these great things, you know, that we've built, and San Francisco does have a long history with this, and it's interesting to, you know, as this debate's come out, just to see the number of developments and projects and things in cities that have redevelopment money in them. It seems like it's everything, almost.
I don't know the answer to this, maybe you don't, but I wonder if with all of the plans we now have for the America's Cup, and a lot of that has to do with rehabilitating piers, if we're going to lose money on that, which could adversely impact the whole America's Cup thing.
I haven't seen that on the list. It might be. I know the Candlestick project is they've signed contracts, and that's Governor Brown has said, well, if things are in the pipeline and moving, you know, then they will be safe. But
so
but new things.
That's caused everyone to do this rush, right? Okay, we're going to forge these contracts right away and these plans right away because we don't want to lose out on the money. Isn't that a concern of Brown then, that maybe we aren't going to pencil out getting as much money from this as we expected because everyone's trying to get in right now?
That is a concern. There was a great editorial cartoon in the Sacramento Bee this week of, it was the new gold rush and all these cities and counties jumping for the redevelopment funds. You know, Governor Brown was asked on Monday, you know, whether he might consider pushing for a freeze on this. He said that's something, he would like to take a look at.
But Mayor Brown used redevelopment money to make a great part of Oakland's new waterfront. I mean, what does he say about that?
He acknowledges that. He says, you know, at the time we didn't have a $25 billion deficit, and he actually was a little flip about it. He went to an event in front of all these city officials earlier in the week and tried to sell them a little bit on his plan, and he said, you know, he mentioned the Fox Theater, which is one of the projects, and he said, I'm sure glad we got that done before this budget came out.
Well, that puts him in a rather peculiar position. And right now we have three cities, the three largest cities around here that are in a peculiar position. They are all in turmoil about their police chiefs, Rachel.
Right, it's amazing. Oakland, San Jose, San Francisco are all going to be potentially in the search for police chief. And it's always, you know, crime's always one of those bread and butter issues for constituents, and being the police chief is a big deal in all these cities. So there are two things at play right now. One, San Francisco's police chief, George Gascon, fairly new to the job. He got appointed to be the district attorney of San Francisco. He's a lawyer. He's never been a prosecutor. It was one of Gavin Newsom's last tasks as being mayor before he went on to the lieutenant governor's job to say, all right, here's a vacancy in the DA spot because Kamala Harris went to the state attorney general's office. So San Francisco will be looking for a new chief. And then Anthony Batts, the police chief of Oakland, well loved by the constituents, the rank and file, a lot of the politicians like him. He said, well, guess what, folks? I might be going to San Jose, which has a vacancy as well. He's one of two finalists to be the police chief of San Jose. He just kind of dropped it on Mayor Kwan a week ago on Friday. He told his rank and file, the police union that he's doing, and he's saying, right now I am the police chief of Oakland. I might be going to San Jose. And then San Jose is looking for its police chief as well. Right now, Christopher Moore, a longtime police officer there, is in the acting position. He's one of two finalists for that job. Now, there's a possibility maybe they'll just do this big shuffle, kind of like rolling in the dice and saying, okay, Batts, you go to San Francisco, Moore, you go to Oakland.
It's a volleyball team. They're just going to rotate.
Yeah, so it really has a lot of people kind of figuring out what to do. It puts Jean Kwan, the new mayor of Oakland, in a very, very difficult spot because Oakland's crime rate is probably the #1 issue on constituents' minds.
You know, you've covered this so long. I guess my question to you is, a police agency, in a real sense, kind of, you know, breathes on its own and operates on its own. And while the chief is very important and sets policy, the reality is the policing goes on and on. Will this be such a great upset, or is it just because these people are relatively new that it would be, you know, just hard to swallow all at once?
I think it could be an upset, particularly for Oakland. It's under fire in a number of places, especially when you look at police staffing and kind of police morale, not only within the department but within the community. Batts was expecting to have a police force of about 800 people, officers. Now he has about 650 people. A big touted community policing program had to be put on hold because of budget problems. It's a chance that Oakland's police department could be put under federal receivership because of the whole Riders case from what was in about 8 years ago or so. That it's under a federal monitor right now to make sure that reform measures are put in place. Oakland's not been able to meet those guidelines that the federal officials wanted. If they don't do that, then that's kind of another step.
And I think there's also a community confidence kind of dimension to this as well, because Batts is a very good public speaker, a very good communicator, and he spent a lot of time putting himself out there in the community and sort of having get-to-know-me kind of meetings. And he's only been there a year, and now it's like, well, I may be leaving. So I think a lot of people sort of have a little bit of whiplash from that as well.
Right, but Tom, you're right. I mean, the police department will run regardless, but the police chief really does set a tone for the police department. Are you going to come in as a reformer? Are you going to come in who's someone who's going to do status quo? For politicians can hide behind their police chiefs, or they can blame their police chiefs for something. And Jean Kwan's it's going to be a big choice. If Batts indeed does go to San Jose, she said she's going to do a national search. She's got to figure out how you can attract someone to come to Oakland. In fact, I was really surprised about a phrase she said. She's like, we're a mid-sized city, Oakland. I can understand why someone might come here and then want to go on to somewhere else. Now, I think if I was trying to recruit someone, I might say what a dynamic city we are in Oakland, what opportunities and challenges to do community policing, to have a diverse community, to bring in a different kind, to do reforms there. And she didn't do that yet.
She already has had problems with her relationship with the police department.
Right.
And so she needed a good friend within the department to move forward.
Right.
And she's made some promises to some neighborhoods who've had lots of trouble.
Right. And on the other hand, she was taken by surprise by Chief Batts. She didn't expect him to go. And in San Francisco, they're going to have to decide what to do as well. Chief Gascon came in after Heather Fong. She's a career police officer who really didn't have the support of the rank and file there. He came in as an outsider, one of the few who's ever been an outsider chief in San Francisco. Same kind of thing, dynamic, he's a good public speaker, got the public behind him, the rank and file behind him. Now they have to decide, do they go to an outsider? Do they go from within? They are thinking of putting another woman in charge, first lesbian in charge of the San Francisco Police Department is kind of the front runner for the job. Denise Schmidt, that's a possibility. And Gascon's number 2 guy, Jeff Godin, is also there. He came from LA. Whether he stays in or not, I think that's when you're going to see some trouble.
Let's talk about San Jose. I mean, its big problems.
San Jose has some big problems in terms of community relations with the police department. Large Latino population there. There's been trouble in the past. There's been troubles with the police department and use of the tasers and fatalities connected with that. We're also seeing that, like all cities, San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose, that there are real budget problems. So you might have grand plans of how you want to do policing in your community, but budget constraints really keep police departments from doing that.
Well, it seems like the coach should run around. The coach goes from this team to that team and all that, and it's just like, what about the team? What about the fans, i.e. the citizens who are paying for all this, watching this juggling
Bruce
going
Bochy maybe can go into one of the police departments. He had a World Series win. Maybe he could have a win into police.
Maybe, I don't know. But it seems like they sure are hopping around.
Yeah.
Well, Tom, you refresh us on a story that we covered vigorously a while back, and that was the PG&E explosion in San Bruno. What's been found out lately about what went on there?
Just today, the NTSB released a report, and without making any conclusions and without making any recommendations, they did say basically that what they found was that, first of all, despite the fact that PG&E initially said that this was a seamless pipe, that in fact it was a seamed pipe, and that in fact they found cracked welds.
Explain that. Let's stop, because that's important right there.
When you make a pipe that is seamless, you kind of push metal through a ring and it comes out like as a whole piece. When you make a seamed pipe, you take a flat piece of metal, bend it up, and then you weld along the seam. That's just basically what the difference is. And done correctly, one can be as good as the other. That's not the problem. But apparently what happened here was that the metallurgists that looked at this 50-foot section found that there were some cracked welds, and they also found that there were some not all that good welds. Now remember, this is welding that's 50 years old. On the other hand, PG&E was relying on this to carry this enormous amount of gas under enormous pressure. So at least they say that it was not corrosion. They say that it was not any puncture, that it has something to do with these welds, ostensibly, again, without making any conclusions. As a result, PG&E has lowered the pressure in all of these similar pipes by 20%, just to add a safety factor. But the NTSB report really starts narrowing what needs to be done in order to worry about these other pipes that over the last 8 years or so, there are about 10 pipes in the system, big pipes like this, where they have spiked the pressure up to the maximum operating pressure. I think it's about 400 pounds per square inch, just to test them, to see if they leak, to see if they're good and all of that. But if you have defective welds, or if you have problems with the welds or anything like that, then you run the risk of causing another problem, even though the pipes are probably rated for many hundreds of pounds of pressure on top of that. But apparently this pipe had some sort of a problem that was not expected and was not believed was going to happen. Bottom line is that they now have a pretty good idea of what happened. Now they've got to get to the root cause of it, which will take more months.
Tom, does PG&E not know what kinds of pipes it has where, or was there some deception, and which would be worse?
Well, that's going to be a major question, and one of the things that's true is that the San Mateo District Attorney's Office is very interested in getting information from the California Public Utilities Commission about what they knew and how they knew it and when they knew it, and therefore what PG&E knew. So, and that's been delayed, and the DA is complaining about that. The question does go to the issue. Did they know what kind of pipe it really was, or was it the fact that it was buried there for a half century? They kind of thought they knew what it was, but they really didn't know what it was.
Let's talk about that. I mean, you said a half century, 50, 60 years. Records keeping was very different then. It was probably all done by hand on some ledger that was put in someone's desk somewhere, and you're lucky if you shared it with someone else. I mean, do we have any faith that PG&E is trying to actually update their records now and make it that it's accessible to everyone except in the little small office somewhere?
Sure, and I think for most of their big pipes they have a pretty good idea because they can run these robotic checking machines down there and really take a look at them, the seams, the welds, everything like that. The trouble is because this pipe is an amalgamation of several pieces welded together, they couldn't get that kind of machine in there. So the way you test is you sniff on the surface, you do helicopters that look for methane traces, you do other kinds of things. And then the other problem is that if you really want to know, then what you do is you stop the gas from flowing, you fill it with water and really pressurize it and see, safely if this thing is going to fail or not. The trouble is that's expensive and you have to reroute gas and all that stuff. Much easier, much simpler if you just put a whole lot of gas pressure there. The trouble is if something fails, now you've got something highly volatile that can explode or can cause a leak that may be very hard to detect. Having said all of that, you're right. The record keeping from 50, 60 years ago is way different. And I saw a picture of San Bruno back during that era of time. And what you see is this little town of San Bruno sitting at the bottom of the hill and a couple of roads running up there and nothing up top. When that thing was put in there, they buried it, they put it in, they kind of forgot about it. The city grew up around it, and the trouble is the city grew up right on top of it.
Is there any sense of what direction this is going as far as how this is going to end up, how people are going to be punished? Are we talking possible criminal penalties? Is it civil, or is it too soon to know on that?
It's too soon to know. There are definitely going to be some penalties because one of the things that is absolutely expected is you don't kill 8 people and destroy almost 40 homes. That we know there's going to be some consequence to. But on top of that, you have other issues that are coming up here. A number of lawsuits have been filed now by people whose homes were destroyed and by people, whose families lost members and all that stuff. So that's going to be one thing. The other thing that's really fascinating about this is, and we go back to Governor Brown, when I went to the last PUC meeting, which was just a couple of weeks ago, there are 2 guys, there are 3 people sitting there. There's the president, and he's got a longer term, but he can be taken out of the presidency. There's another person that's there for long term, and then there's one person that Jerry Brown has to reconfirm. There are 2 empty seats. In the next 2 weeks, Jerry Brown could completely change the complexion and the attitude of that to be a much more pro-consumer, much more tough on the utility industry kind of CPUC. Because one of the criticisms you hear about the CPUC from the utility reform group and other consumer groups is that it's too much of a handmaiden to the utilities. Now what they're saying is let's get some people in there who will be fair-minded brokers who have a pro-public attitude rather than a pro-industry attitude.
Brown's appointments secretary, though, is a former PG&E executive, the person who's doing a lot of the vetting and the final checking on these people.
But when you have the utility reform group taking a close look at that, in fact, it's very likely that one of their people, a guy named Mike Florio, is going to end up on the California Public Utilities Commission. He was on the electricity board for a long time and all that. So it'll be really interesting, but I promise you it'll be a much more down the middle of the road kind of a organization than it was, let's say 6 months ago.
Just a few seconds. What's PG&E's attitude about this?
I think they are absolutely, at the operational level, mortified as much as you could possibly be. The question is, does that extend all the way to the top? That's an issue that the investigators will learn.
Well, my thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight.